It is indeed my pleasure to welcome you to this first plenary session of this year's IFES U.S. election program. My name is Michael Svetlik. I'm the Vice President of Programs, and I'm very pleased to be the moderator for today's session. It seems fitting this session is a beginning to 4 days of learning and experience sharing. The primer that Bill mentioned that's in your packets was authored by Thad Hall, one of our speakers, and we're very pleased to make this available to everyone and have this be the subject of today's plenary session. It's intended to provide a common basis of knowledge of the U.S. electoral system, from its legal framework to voting methodology to political culture. It is an innovation in this year's U.S. election program. For us, IFES has conducted similar programs like this for about 10 times over the last 20 years, and we have never somehow seemed to start with a basic introduction to the U.S. system. So we're pleased to do that today, to provide that common basis from which we can begin our common exchange of about what we're going to experience over the next 4 days. I'll briefly introduce our speakers. Bill gave some short introductory remarks, but I'll also include my introduction as part of this panel. Professor Thad Hall, to my left, is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Utah. In addition to the author of this fine publication, he has done research on election administration and implications of voting technologies. He has observed and written extensively about elections in Estonia as countries to implement internet voting. He's also the author of numerous books on internet voting, election administration, election reform, and voter confidence. Doug is a director of the Program for Excellence in Election Administration at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota. He's the founding director of Election Initiatives, which has been a nationally recognized voice of election reform since 2001. And as Bill mentioned, led a very influential effort with the Pew Charitable Trust for over a decade. So we are in excellent hands this afternoon for a discussion and introduction to the U.S. electoral system. Both presenters will present for approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll go to your questions and hope to have a very robust discussion and sharing of views and viewpoints. We will, at 3:35 past the hour of 3 o'clock, we will break for about 20 minutes to refuel and re-energize. There'll be a coffee break outside. And then we'll reconvene here at 4 o'clock and continue the question and answer session. As we move to that session, I'll provide additional information about how we'll collect those questions and be able to handle the questions in multiple languages. So with those few remarks, I would like to ask Dr. Thad Hall to begin.
Thank you very much, and on behalf of Doug and myself, I'd like to thank all of you for being here today, and I'd like to thank the wonderful staff of IFES for all the help that they gave us in putting together the primer and putting together the materials we're going to be presenting today. And I would just like to start out by picking up on a point that Mr. Sweeney brought up, which is that on Wednesday morning or on Tuesday night, you are going to come up to him and you are going to tell him that our elections are crazy, and it's our job to explain these crazy elections to you. So we will be priming you on all of the idiosyncratic facts and attributes of our election system. So as you all know, the 2012 election, it's a presidential election year. So we have Mitt Romney competing against President Obama, but it's also a congressional election year. So we have 435 members of Congress who are running. We also have 33 members of the U.S. Senate who are running. So in 33 states, there are Senate elections. In most states, there are elections for state offices on the ballot. There are also elections for governor in several states. But we also elect Supreme Court judges in many states and other judges. So we have judicial elections on our ballots. We have school board elections on our ballots. And we even elect sheriffs in the United States. So our ballots are very complicated. This election is more than just the presidential election. It is a whole array of elections all on one ballot. And so, for instance, before I came here, I voted early, in person, in Utah, and this is what my ballot looked like. So I had a choice for, so if you look at the ballot here, I had a choice for president. I voted for a House race, a Senate race, a House race, governor, all sorts of state offices, judges. Voted for, I had constitutional amendment questions that I voted on. So we voted on an array of things in the United States. Our elections are very complicated. And they're even more complicated because we have an odd system for electing our president. So I'm going to do this very slowly. I drew the short straw, and so I get to explain the Electoral College to all of you. So in the United States, we have 2 U.S. senators in every state, and then we apportion members of the U.S. House of Representatives based on population. Every state has at least 1 House member, and the state of California has 53. They're the largest state, so they have 53 members. The way the Electoral College works is that each state has a number of electors that are equal to the number of House members plus the number of senators, so it ranges from 3 in a state like Montana to 55 in California. To become president of the United States, it does not matter if the presidential candidate has the most votes overall. What matters is that he has the most votes in enough states to get 270 electoral votes. So what you will see potentially on Tuesday, for instance, is it could work out that one of the candidates will have 270 or more electoral votes, but not have a majority of the overall votes in the election. So what matters is which candidate wins states. So for instance, the state of Ohio is a very important state. It's the closest state in this election, and whoever wins that state will likely win. It has 20 electoral votes, and it's the state that's most what we would refer to as being in play right now. And so what matters in a presidential election is that you win that state. And then you win all the electoral votes for that state. This is the state of Iowa. For congressional races, they allocate a number of House seats to a state based on their population. Then what the state does is that they then allocate, they then draw congressional districts based on the population of that state. So this, for example, is the way the map looks in the state of Iowa. They divide up the state based on population. So each of these 4 districts has equal population. And so what we try to do under law is to make sure that each person in a state has equal representation. Finally, you all are, I'm sure, aware of this, but we have 2 primary political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats are represented by the donkey, and the Republicans by elephants. I'm sure that I used to know why, but I'm not really sure now. But these are the 2 parties. We only have 2 parties primarily because we run elections where for the House and the Senate, whoever gets the majority of the votes wins, and that type of system tends to lead itself to having only 2 parties. So when you don't have proportional representation, you tend to get 2 parties. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Doug, who's going to explain to you a little bit about the laws that govern voting rights in the U.S.
Thank you, Thad. And I know he said he was going to welcome you on my behalf, but I never listened to Thad. So I'm going to welcome you myself as well. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be in a room with so many people who are committed to and work so hard at something that I care an awful lot about, and that is administering elections. There are many people like you across the country who work very hard at representing their citizens and helping them cast ballots, and it's an honor to have you with us to see the strange and sometimes beautiful system of American elections on Election Day. I am, in addition to someone who is interested in the election process, trained as an attorney, and so Thad asked me, among other things, to talk about very briefly some of the basic laws and rules covering American elections in the United States. The first thing, and I think this is important to remember, is that unlike many of your countries, there is no explicit right to vote in the American Constitution. For all of our talk in this country about the right to vote and the impact of different procedures on voting rights, there is no explicit right to vote in the United States Constitution. Now, having said that, the Constitution does include several protections for citizens and groups of citizens as part of the Constitution. Initially, the franchise in this country was limited to propertied white males. Over several centuries of American history, we have seen the franchise expand to include new groups. Women were given the right to vote in 1920. If you think about how far the country has come, imagine that my wife and my two daughters less than 100 years ago would not have been able to cast ballots in federal elections in this country. It was also expanded to cover 18-year-olds in the late 60s and early 70s. But the most important, and that I think you will see a lot of on Election Day and hear a lot of discussion about in the run-up to Election Day, are the series of amendments and laws aimed at racial and language minorities in the United States. In 1965, Congress enacted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the Voting Rights Act was aimed at protecting the franchise for certain racial minorities in the United States. And as part of that act, the federal government was given tremendous authority over the states in protecting the voting rights of minorities on Election Day. Nationwide, under a section of the act called Section 2, the federal government has the right to bring suit against states and localities who fail to protect the rights of racial minorities. In some parts of the country, largely concentrated in the American South, but not exclusively in the American South, a different section, Section 5, says that states and localities in those areas may not change or implement changes to their election laws or procedures until those changes have been approved by the federal government. That gives the federal government tremendous leverage over the conduct of elections in those states, and as many of you will probably see and will talk about today, have resulted in frictions with some of their states and localities over time. It's important to note that, as both Mr. Sweeney and Thad noted, even though we have federal elections on the ballot, there is no federal election system in the United States. We do not have a single agency which runs elections. And so the federal role vis-a-vis the states and localities is very important and becomes something which is often a source of conflict more than cooperation across the country. I'll keep going. Yep, we'll keep going. Over time, also, we have expanded or enacted federal laws intended to protect or enhance the voting experience and the voting rights of different groups. Over time, we have enacted a series of laws. I will spare you the acronyms, but laws aimed at helping not just American military members and their families, but also American citizens overseas, giving them an opportunity to cast a ballot. Just a couple years ago, Congress updated the initial law passed in 1986 to ensure that states and localities were making ballots available to Americans around the world at least 45 days before Election Day. And that became another source of authority for the federal government with regard to casting and counting of ballots across the country. In the early 90s, the National Voter Registration Act, which many of you will hear referred to here in the United States as Motor Voter, was passed. and there states and localities were required to make voter registration available to voters, not just at election offices, but at a wide range of governmental offices, including motor vehicle agencies, social service agencies, and the like. That has, in many ways, been at the root of some of the current debates in this country over eligibility and identification, but it is a very important part of the American electoral system. And then finally, you see the very unfortunate gentleman from our Florida recount of 2000. I fear that this gentleman, when he passes away, that this picture will appear with his obituary. But after the Florida debacle in 2000, Congress enacted something called the Help America Vote Act, which was intended to help states and localities modernize their election procedures and bring them at least into a little more uniform approach to some of the parts of the electoral process. Probably the most significant of those was the creation of a new federal agency and some roughly $4 billion in new federal funding, which states then used to purchase new machines and the like. All of these laws, the Constitution, these recent statutes, really underlie a lot of what you will see in your polling places and in your precincts on Election Day. Thank you, Dad. One more. These three seals represent the three agencies at the federal government who have the greatest authority over the American electoral system. In the upper left corner, you see the United States Election Assistance Commission, created by the Help America Vote Act of 2002. In the upper right, you see the Federal Election Commission, which largely oversees our system of campaign finance. And front and center, both on this slide and in the American electoral process, is the United States Department of Justice, which is not only responsible for overseeing election administration consistent with a lot of the federal laws I talked about, but in bringing suit against jurisdictions if and when those laws are not properly followed. It's important to note that two of these three agencies are currently far less effective than the other. The Department of Justice is still going strong and is a key player on federal election policy. The Election Assistance Commission currently has no sitting members, is operating on a drastically reduced budget, and is the subject of a fierce tug-of-war in Congress about the future of the agency with regard to American elections. The Federal Election Commission has long been a source of controversy between the parties because it stands at the very difficult point of deciding what money can and cannot be used in the political process. But I would imagine that as you will go around the country over the next several days, you will hear more about the Justice Department than you will the other two agencies. And with that, I'll turn it back.
Just to reiterate a point that Doug was just making, one of the things that does make the United States unique is that we have no central election administration. So when you think about the Election Assistance Commission, that commission was explicitly created to have no power over elections. They cannot pass rules or regulations that affect states in any way. And instead what you see are that states are the people who run elections. So we have 50 state, normally elected secretaries of state who run our elections. These people are normally partisanly elected, so they're either Democrats or Republicans, and they are the people who are in charge of doing the final certification for votes. So since you'll be going to the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, they actually have an election board. That's the other way that elections are run, is there are state boards in some places. But the place that elections really happen are in the roughly 10,500 local election jurisdictions in the United States. These are normally local municipalities, counties, or cities. So for instance, the states of Wisconsin and Michigan both have approximately 1,500 local election officials in each state. So those are the people who generally run our election. These are people who have other positions other than running elections. They're often county clerks or city clerks. So they do an array of other activities in addition to running elections, but these are the people who find the polling places, find the poll workers, and actually make elections work on election day. These are the people who are in charge of that activity and making these things work.
And actually, before Thad goes on to talk a little more about how we vote in this country, I think it is important to understand that we do not have a uniform election system in this country. In fact, one of my favorite, I hope, humorous remarks that I make to international visitors is that, contrary to popular belief, we do have a uniform system of elections in this country, and it is this, that everybody does it their own way and cannot believe that anybody would do it any differently. You will see a lot of that on election day.
Exactly. And so the places that elections are really run in the United States are in polling places. This is an example of a polling place, and these are the people who implement our laws in a real way. These are the people who make decisions about voting in elections, are these actual poll workers. So when we think about how we vote, America is a place where we, as Doug was saying, we do it the way we do it in our local jurisdiction. So in 48 of our 50 states, so as Mr. Sweeney was pointing out, in Oregon and in Washington State, people do not vote in person. They vote by mail. But most places, people do vote in polling locations on election day, or they have that. But in the United States, the most popular and growing ways of voting in many states are to vote early. So for instance, in the state of Utah, where I am from, I could vote in the 2 weeks prior to the election in person in a variety of localities within the county in which I live. Early voting is very popular in the southern United States and in the West. And so, for instance, in New York and New Jersey and, in New York and in New England generally, they don't have early voting. People only vote pretty much on election day. And the other way that people vote is they vote by mail. People are mailed ballots sometime within the 45 days prior to the election. They can complete their ballot, and then those ballots are checked. They check the signatures on the ballot to make sure that they match the signature on file, and then those ballots are opened and they're counted. In the 2008 election, approximately 1 out of every 3 voters voted early. In this election, it's likely to be higher than that. And so when you go watch people vote on election day, you will only probably be watching 60% of the American electorate out that day, because 40% of those people will have already cast their ballots. As Doug was pointing out, after the Florida 2000 election debacle and the passage of the Help America Vote Act, most jurisdictions switched voting technologies, and we primarily use one of 2 voting technologies in the United States today. Either we vote on what we refer to as a paper optical scan ballot, where you fill in the circle next to the name of the candidate or the name of the party or the name of the ballot initiative that you're interested in. That ballot is then scanned through a scanner. The scanner can tell you if you've made a mistake on your ballot, so if you've overvoted or you have undervoted, that scanner can tell you that, and then you would have a chance to fix your ballot. And the other way that we vote, this is how I voted, or actually my 10-year-old son voted for me. We vote using what we call direct recording electronic or DRE voting machines. You just touch the screen to make your vote selection. As you'll see on this photo, there is a set of headphones. So if you're a person who is blind, the ballot can be read to you so that you can make selections. There's also, if you look right below the keypad, that is where there would be what we refer to as a paper audit record that is printed so that your electronic selections are then recorded onto a piece of paper, and you're able to confirm that what is showing up on the screen as your vote is actually on a piece of paper as well, so that if there was a question about the vote, we would be able to go back and audit that election.
That, if I'll just add at this point, that in the 3 jurisdictions that you will observe polling on Tuesday, you will see these two voting methods in action. In the District of Columbia, where I'm a resident, we use optical scan primarily, but also have DRE machines available for those with disabilities. So it's very relevant to what you'll see on Tuesday.
On Election Day, and I should point out that in law, Election Day is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Why it's on, we just like our Tuesdays. I'm not really sure why. But the thing that's interesting about that is that states are allowed to select the time that they're open. So you see here the 3 states that you'll be visiting. In one state, the polls open at 6 and close at 7, and in the other 2 jurisdictions, they open at 7 and close at 8. Here's the interesting thing to think about, though. Last Monday, New Jersey and New York were hit by Hurricane Sandy. If Hurricane Sandy had hit tomorrow, it's unclear how those states would have held elections. And there's no provision for them to be able to make any sort of changes to address this problem. And so there are procedures for how they would have selected members of Congress, and it would have been done in a very partisan way because the House of Representatives gets to determine who their members are. So they could have picked all Republicans to fill those seats. But we have an election system that is very fixed on it being on a very specific day, and states get to pick the times in which they vote.
Talk about people in line.
Oh, sorry. Doug was pointing out that if you're in line at 8 o'clock in Maryland, you still get to vote. We close the line, but we don't close the doors on people who are in line. So as long as you're in line, you get to vote. So we do ensure that people who are in line on Election Day, as long as you get there by 8, you get to vote.
And I'm very occasionally, and I'll get to this later, but occasionally in situations where there are problems or bad weather, a court can order that poll hours be extended. If that happens, that usually creates lots of excitement, especially after the election, which I will get to at the end of the presentation.
So where do we vote? We vote in a variety of locations. We vote in schools. This is the most common place that people vote. They vote in some sort of school or community center. People also vote in fire stations. So this is the Chicago Fire Department polling place. And this is a Kmart, which is like a Walmart. It's a big box retailer, and they even hold polling sometimes in businesses as well. So we hold elections in a variety of interesting places in America. And so when you think about our elections, we run them in a very interesting way. The last thing I wanted to point out in this section is to just talk to you for a moment about our ballots. This is what we refer to as an office block ballot. Ballots in general look this way, where each office is separated, and so you can see there's a box for the president, a box for Senate, a box for vice president. But in some states, you can also vote what we refer to as a straight party option. So instead of voting for each of those races, so instead of voting for, if I was a Democrat, voting for President Obama and then other Democrats on the ballot, I can just select the Democratic Party and I would vote straight party. It would register a vote for all Democratic candidates on the ballot for me. And so in some states, they have straight party voting, and in some states, they don't. And that, again, is a choice that, that states make. And so Doug is going to now talk to you a little bit about who can vote and some of the issues associated with our voting process.
So in this country, there are a variety of requirements that you must meet in order to be able to cast a ballot. You must be 18 years old on Election Day. You must be a citizen of the United States, at least for federal elections and most state and local elections. In many states, you must not have been convicted of a felony, which in our country tends to be any crime punishable by a year or more in prison. That is not, unsurprisingly, a uniform rule. Inmates, felons in the states of Maine and Vermont, in the far northeast of the United States, are able to cast ballots. I always refer to them as the ultimate captive audience for candidates. But the most important that makes the United States, if not unique in the world, at least somewhat unique, is that you must actively register yourself to cast a ballot. We have a voter-initiated registration system in this country. We do not have a civil registry. We do not have some sort of government election list. We have the responsibility of voters to register themselves to vote and indicate their eligibility to cast a ballot. That responsibility currently extends to notifying both a new and old jurisdiction of a change in address. And in a country where, on average, 1 in 7 Americans moves every year, that can create quite a challenge for election officials across the country. Some states, though, have made it at least marginally easier to register to vote by enacting something known as same-day or election day registration. And this map that Thad has helpfully put together for us indicates those small number of states where you can either register and vote on election day at the polling place, or in a couple of states like Ohio and North Carolina, register at a separate place and cast a ballot on the same day. In other states, you have to register or update your registration as many as 30 days before Election Day. And voters who fail to do so may find themselves on the outside looking in when Election Day comes. Now, all of this uncertainty about who is and isn't on the registration rolls, and I know that that's a concern in all of your countries, just as it is in the United States, has led us to a debate over an issue that many of you may not even think is terribly debatable, and that is whether or not to require voters to identify themselves at the polls. The debate over voter ID and photographic or photo ID in this country has gotten very hot and very ugly over the last 2 years. With that, though, we still have a wide range of state experiences. Some states have very strict photo identification laws. Indiana, Georgia, Kansas, and Tennessee. If you do not have a photo ID, even if you are otherwise an eligible and registered voter, the failure to have that ID can cause you not to have the opportunity to cast a valid ballot. Other places, like my home across the river in the Commonwealth of Virginia, you're required to show an ID, but it need not be a photo ID. And in still other places, whether or not you are required to show a photo ID or other kind of ID, failure to produce such an ID is not fatal to your right to vote. You can actually sign an affidavit swearing that you are who you say you are, you live where you say you live, and that you are an eligible voter, and your ballot will be counted. There's still other places where you need not register, you need not show any identification at all. You simply state your name and your address for the record, and you have the opportunity to cast a ballot at the polls. I have had a request to explain why photo identification is controversial, because that may not be obvious. Part of it is linked to that long series of constitutional amendments and statutes that I discussed earlier. Americans feel very strongly about the right to vote, although paradoxically, not all of us appear to be willing to use it. But there is concern that requiring a photo ID to vote will somehow disenfranchise otherwise eligible voters at the polls. This has led to a follow-on discussion of, well, then why not require everyone to show photo ID and create some sort of national identification to make that possible? And I realize that many of you either have something like that or have discussed it as well. The United States, just as we do elections differently everywhere, has a very strong tendency away from central government. And the combination of fear of central government and resistance to infringement on personal privacy makes requiring any kind of identification for any purpose a very difficult argument in the American political process. Having said that, I think that these debates over photo ID and voter ID are likely to continue beyond 2012 and will be with us. And in many cases, I think we may start to see folks in this country looking to the experience from countries like yours about how to proceed.
And I would add that we'll have a panel discussion on the issue itself on Wednesday following the election, so we can get deeper into that issue at that time.
And then one other thing that Thad pointed out, and I do want to make sure that we mention, is that we've extended lots of protections to voters in a variety of situations. One of them that's very important is protections for voters with disabilities. And disabilities can be very widely defined. Everything from voters who are actually blind to voters with visual impairments, even with some cognitive and mobility impairments. Everything from folks in a wheelchair to voters with cerebral palsy and other issues. The system is designed, or is intended to be designed, to allow those voters to cast a ballot, not just that counts, but is also private and independent, so that if the voter does not want help in casting her ballot, she need not have it in order to do so effectively.
And likewise, I would just mention that the other group of people that we do work very hard to enfranchise as well are people who are language minorities. So one of the groups, as Doug was pointing out under the Voting Rights Act, are what we refer to as language minorities. If a jurisdiction meets a certain threshold of having a certain minority population that is a language minority, so for instance, Spanish-speaking people in Florida would be an example of this, those jurisdictions have to provide ballots in a separate language, and then they have to also, in some cases, provide translator services in polling places as well. So Doug and I have both been in Los Angeles, where they do ballots in 7 different languages.
It's actually 9 now.
Is it 9 now?
It's 9.
So what are the 2 that they have?
They added a couple of more Asian languages. But you'll get, and again, the American populace is diverse enough, and oftentimes new citizens will congregate. You get some, so there is currently a community in the state of Michigan that is required to make language, election materials available in, I believe it's the Bangladeshi language. You have the Hmong people who have a large population in the northern state of Minnesota. Anywhere enough voters who require language assistance are present, the federal government requires that federal, state, and local election authorities make election materials and personnel available who can assist voters with casting their ballots.
So now we want to talk a little bit about who actually is registered to vote and who votes in American elections. So I'm going to present some data to you from the 2008 election. The United States Census Bureau collects data on registration and voting through what we refer to as the current population survey. And so one of the things that you will see here, first of all, I'm going to start at the bottom and actually go up, is that in the United States, women are more likely to be registered to vote and to vote compared to men. We also see turnout differences with non-Hispanic whites voting at the highest rate, followed by African Americans, people who are of Asian descent, and people who are Hispanic. One of the things that's interesting about the 2008 election, obviously, is that because Barack Obama, who's African American, was on the ballot, African American turnout in the U.S. increased pretty dramatically in the 2008 election. When we think about voting by age, the population of the U.S., older people vote much more than younger people do, and they're more likely to be registered, and they vote at much higher rates. And so you see this, in the way that candidates frame their arguments, and they, really push issues that are benefit older Americans often compared to younger people, because younger people are harder to turn out in many respects. If we look at voting by education, not surprisingly, people with the most education vote the most, and people with the least education, they vote less than half of the time. And so, this is not surprising if you think about it. And then finally, we also see something very similar for income. People with higher incomes vote at much higher rates than people with lower incomes. And in the United States, we do quite a good job of trying to mobilize people with disabilities to register to vote. But one of the things that we see is that people with disabilities are registered at lower rates than people without disabilities, and they vote at lower rates. One of the things I would note here, though, is that states that have flexible absentee voter laws, So in some states, you have to request an absentee ballot, and in some states, you can become a permanent absentee voter, where they always send you an absentee ballot. And in states that have that permanent absentee voter status for people with disabilities vote at a much higher rate than they do in those states without. 1800s, we had single-party ballots. And so you either voted for one party or the other, and ballots actually were not printed by government people, they were printed by the parties. And so parties would often give people things for voting, like shoes or alcohol, things like that. And so people would trade things for their votes. And then we went to having the government run our elections and having secret ballots. And over time, the government has put in place different regulations. So in the early 1900s, they put in regulations that limited the ability of corporations to contribute to campaigns. And after World War II, we put in regulations that limited the ability of unions to provide direct contributions to candidates. And then in the early 1970s, we put in place limits on the way in which campaigns had to report money and limits on how much money could be spent. In the last couple of years, we've had some changes to these laws. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled, for instance, that corporations cannot contribute, and unions cannot contribute directly to candidates, but they can engage in independent expenditures where they can buy advertising, or wealthy people can pool money and give money to groups in unlimited amounts and spend money on campaigns. So this is spending, this chart shows you spending, and these are in millions of dollars. So one of the things you will see here is that the presidential campaign of Governor Mitt Romney has raised almost $400 million in this campaign cycle. But outside groups that support him have raised almost $650 million, and they spend they can spend that money on his behalf. By contrast, President Obama has raised about $650 million, but outside groups that support him have spent almost $300 million. So in this election cycle, we will spend over $2 billion on our presidential campaign. And most of this money will go to purchase advertising. So if you turn on your TV tonight, you will see ads for all these candidates. Before we came in here, Doug and I were in the lobby of the hotel, and in the course of 3 minutes, we saw 6 commercials for different candidates. And so in the US, individual candidates can also spend unlimited sums of money on their own campaigns. So if a very wealthy person runs for office, they're allowed to spend an unlimited sum of their own money because it is considered to be part of their First Amendment rights of free speech to engage in that sort of political speech. The other thing I want to point out is what candidates use their money for. Now, I was pointing out just a minute ago that they use their money for advertising. However, advertising is not necessarily the most effective way to mobilize people. It's the easiest way to reach a large number of people, but one of the things that we know about elections is going and meeting people face to face and asking for their vote, and having people in your community who support a candidate come up to you and explain to you why you should vote for that candidate is actually one of the best ways of mobilizing people. And so we have seen a resurgence over the last 12 years of face-to-face canvassing, going door to door by political parties. So if you, in this election, for instance, President Obama's campaign, who strongly believes in this, they have offices across the US where they have volunteers going door to door, and they use very sophisticated computer technology to identify the people to go see and the messages that they're going to use to try to persuade those people to vote for them. People also engage in what is called phone banking, where you call up people who are likely voters and get them to vote. Doug and I are both friends with a person who lives in the state of Oregon, where they have all vote by mail voting. And our friend votes the first day he gets his ballot, because if you don't vote the first day, the parties will start calling you asking you if you've sent in your ballot and if you're going to vote for their candidates. And so if you send in their thing, you get checked off the list of people who have voted. And so campaigns can buy from or get from the elections offices across the United States. They can often get the list of people who have voted. So they may not know how you voted, but they can at least know if you've been to the polls or not. And so they use phones and going door to door to mobilize people. And this is a woman who lives in the state of Ohio. She was in the Washington Post the other day, and this is her mail from one day. Going to her mailbox one day, she received all of these circulars trying to convince her to vote. It turns out this, by the way, is the least effective way of mobilizing people. The most effective way, again, is to go and ask people for their vote face to face. And now we're seeing that also carry out through social media, of people using social media to try to convince people to vote as well. Yeah, well, this is all from a set of experiments that were actually done by two people at Yale University, Don Green and one of his colleagues. And what they did was they actually did a set of randomized experiments where they went door to door, they did phone banking, they did other forms of advertising, and then were able to determine if those people were more likely to vote than a control group of people who did not get that sort of treatment. And that's how they know that these things really work. And we have now seen research done on using Facebook and trying to mobilize people using Facebook, and it's turned out to be very effective, especially for mobilizing younger people. And so we have really had this resurgence in really interesting research on how to mobilize people to vote. We also have presidential debates. We had, between 67 and 51 million people watch either the presidential debates or the vice presidential debates. The first debate was, we had these different formats for the debates. The first and second debates primarily centered on domestic issues, and the third debate centered on foreign policy issues. And these debates were very lively because they provide people with opportunities to engage in use of social media, of using Twitter and Facebook to try to communicate to people about how they thought each of the candidates did. And so we do this to try to give people an opportunity to see how the candidates are doing. And so now I'm going to turn over to Doug to conclude this by talking about all the things that might happen on Wednesday when you think the election is over, how it could really not be over.
Thank you, Thad. Used to be many, many years ago, more than I care to count, I worked on political campaigns in my home community in Northern Virginia. And in those days, the old saying was that you could work all weekend before Election Day without sleep because you could sleep on election night because the election would be over. I am here to tell you that the 2000 presidential election put that notion to rest forever. People in this country now understand that while the voting may stop on election night, that's usually when the counting begins and often when the drama intensifies. And sometimes the result is clear. And in fact, in our country, and perhaps in yours as well, we have a prayer that is known as the election administrator's prayer, which says, "Dear Lord, whoever wins, let the margin be clear and the results be reproducible." Often shorted to, "God, let it be a landslide." As we know, however, and I'm sure all of you have learned in your work, that it isn't always a landslide, and sometimes results are close and the outcome is not clear. And when that happens, one of three things usually happens in this country. First is a recount. And I teach law students election law, and I ask them what a recount is, and I always get, as law students are wont to do, a very long explanation. And invariably I get one student who gets high marks for the day who says, "Aren't you just counting the ballots again?" And that is precisely the right answer. We take that pile of ballots, either physical or virtual, that we have collected on election day, and we count them again to see if the numbers that we reached the first time are the same. And if they are, we know we have a winner, and if they're not, then we know we have a problem. Most jurisdictions in this country allow for recounts when the result is close. Almost none of them have the same rules as to who can request a recount, what's required to get a recount, who will pay for the recount, or how the recount will be conducted. But if elections are close, you can imagine that there will be recounts in one or more communities across the country. And that isn't for the entire ballot. It can be for a single contest on the ballot. So if you are in a state where the presidential election is not close, you may still have a nip and tuck battle for the deputy sheriff in a given county. And if it is that close, there will be a recount. We also have a series of legal proceedings which have a variety of names. They can be called challenges, they can be called contests, they can be called post-election proceedings, and those are cases where even though we know what the pile of ballots says, we are worried or suspect that there is a problem that means that those results don't reflect the true will of the voters on Election Day. And that can be because of mistake, it can be because of malfeasance or bad acts by someone inside or outside the process. Sometimes it can just be the bad weather or some other crisis on Election Day. And again, most states allow jurisdictions or allow participants in an election to bring challenges to an outcome, but there is a very high bar for success in those cases. In those cases, you need to be able to put enough ballots in doubt to put the outcome in doubt. So if you imagine a hypothetical situation where a candidate loses an election by 100,000 votes, but is able to put 90,000 votes in doubt because of problems or fraud or what have you. Under most states' contest rules, that would not be enough for the action to proceed. So even though 90,000 ballots is a lot of ballots alleged to be defective, the fact that it would not overcome the 100,000 vote margin means that the action cannot go forward. Once those go forward, however, virtually the entire electoral process is open for scrutiny. And one could argue, and many of my colleagues in the legal community have argued, that one reason for the Supreme Court's ruling in Bush v. Gore in 2000 was precisely not to lift the lid on the electoral process in Florida because of concerns about what it would do to the legitimacy of the winner and the legitimacy of the American political process. But I will tell you, as someone who's worked in these cases, that they can be lengthy and even as legal cases go, incredibly messy. And then finally, for races for the United States Congress, for the House and the Senate, there is law there is language in the Constitution that says each House shall be the judge of the qualifications of its own members. So if you have an election which is in dispute, the court of last resort for a United States House campaign is the U.S. House. And the court of last resort for a Senate campaign is the U.S. Senate. And judicial courts can weigh in all they want, but ultimately those bodies, by their process, majority vote and what have you, can decide who to seat and who not to seat. We have in the past had very close and sometimes controversial elections. Fortunately, they are very rare, but if we have one or more races in this country for a seat in Congress, either in the House or in the Senate, they could, by early next year, end up in the United States Congress for resolution. So as you can see, and I will turn it back over to Thad to turn it back over to Michael, we have an amazing system in the United States. And you can take that word amazing any way that you like. Thad and I were talking in the back of the room before the session started. I think lots of Americans think that the United States system is unique and better than lots of countries around the world. And I think if nothing else, Thad and I have been able to convince all of you today that the American system is certainly unique. And I wish you good luck in your observations over the next couple of days.
And I'd like to thank you all as well. And obviously, I'm sure that this has piqued many questions that you all have, and so I'll turn it over to Michael to see how we're going to handle that.
Yes, thank you both. Thank you both for covering so much material in such a concise way. It certainly was a great review in many cases, and hopefully offered new insights into why it is we do certain things the way that we do here in the United States. We do have a second session planned with your questions, thoughts, and reflections. We're going to move to that in about 5 minutes. Oh, excuse me, we're going to move to the break in about 5 minutes, but I would like to use the next 5 minutes to begin with a couple of questions that you may have that come immediately to mind for our two presenters. I have colleagues in the room with microphones. If you identify yourself with a microphone, please. You can raise your hand and they will approach you with the microphone. We have interpretation capacity here at the table, and we will be able to listen to questions in all of the languages of the meeting, of the program. If you care to write your question down and pass it forward, that is another way to offer your question, and that will make its way to the head table, and then I'll entertain those questions as I receive them. So before you go to the break, I'd like to offer the opportunity for you to ask a preliminary question. Yes, sir. Good move there. And we'll take 2 questions if we could, and then come to our panelists for answers.
It's currently the interesting case from Florida, which I saw on TV, that the governor reduced. I am Professor Stephanos Dafwang from Nigeria. There's this interesting case in Florida where the governor has reduced the number of days for early voting from 14 to 8. Would you regard that as a kind of a fraud, or who moderates in that particular circumstance? Then the second question is, you talk of only Democrats and Republicans, but in the ballot box there are, I see, about 5 parties. Why don't you talk about the other parties? Are they insignificant, but they are on the ballot box?
Thank you for those questions. And yes, I would ask you to identify yourself when you pose the question. Thank you, sir. Thank you. So we'll take one more here and then move to responses.
My name is Ali Diabate from the Electoral Assistance Division of the United Nations. So my question is the following. What will happen if there is a catastrophe, natural catastrophe, on the voting day? What will happen?
Okay, thank you for that question. First, let's address in Florida, the governor's attempts to limit early voting.
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. Thank you for that. As Thad mentioned, the early voting has expanded in this country dramatically in recent years. And after 2008, when many states made early voting widely available, there were concerns that maybe that the polls were open too long because of the cost to election officials. The thing to remember is that unlike Oregon and Washington, every place that makes early voting available is doing that in addition to and not in lieu of their other voting procedures. And so the concern was that if early voting were open too long, that jurisdictions would be essentially wasting resources. And so some academics, including a mutual colleague, a man named Paul Gronke in Oregon, recommended to legislatures that they consider shortening the early voting period. Although I'm pretty sure what Paul was talking about was shortening it at the front end, that you would not start early voting as early as many states were doing. For whatever reason, many states, including Florida, decided that that also meant closing it the weekend before Election Day. And so while Florida was successful in doing that, the state of Ohio was not. And in fact, the Obama campaign brought suit against the state of Ohio to force them to reopen early voting the weekend before Election Day. I will tell you, I tend to try and stay out of these fights and not have an opinion either way, but I can tell you that many courts and lots of advocates believe that any restriction on early voting the weekend before Election Day in particular has the potential to disenfranchise large numbers of voters, especially voters who often will go to the polling place after worshiping on a Saturday or Sunday before Election Day. So if that new law seems strange to you, you have millions of fellow travelers here in the United States.
To answer your question about the third-party candidates, third-party candidates in general are only important at the margins of an election. So we've had, in most elections, these candidates will only get a very small percentage of the vote, and they're unlikely to win, and so most people don't vote, for these kind of candidates. They are not involved in the presidential debates, for instance, because they don't meet certain thresholds for getting popular support. But I would point out that in 1992 and 1996, there was a significant third-party candidate who received about between 15 and 20% of the vote. And in the 2000 election, there was a third-party candidate named Ralph Nader. And in the state of Florida, that candidate played a very important role potentially in siphoning off votes that would have gone otherwise to Vice President Gore. And many people, say that is one of the reasons why Vice President Gore lost the state of Florida. And actually in this election in the state of Virginia, there is a candidate running for president who is a former legislator in Virginia, who has historically been a Republican, who's running as an independent, and it's thought that he could potentially siphon off some votes that would otherwise go to Governor Romney and could tip the state toward President Obama. So these third-party candidates are not important in the sense that they're unlikely to win, but they do sometimes siphon off candidates from other voters.
Actually, and really, I think what Thad is saying, and at the risk of sounding like I'm making a joke, and I don't mean to, is that third-party candidates tend not to be important except when they are. And occasionally, we do have candidates at the margin who have an impact. And but as someone who grew up in Virginia, Virgil Good, who is this individual to whom Thad is referred, has still a very strong following in certain areas of Virginia. And while he certainly will not be sworn in to the presidency in January of next year, he could have a big impact as to who actually that is.
Right. Yeah, they're important because they siphon off votes from people, not because they're ever going to win. On the question about disasters, just really quickly, we have a very fragile system in the sense that we are required under federal law to hold an election on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. There is no provision in law for what to do in the case of a disaster. There's no provision for voting. You can vote early, but after the election is over, there are no provisions for that. And what that means, for instance, is if Hurricane Sandy had hit the state of New Jersey and New York tomorrow, if it hit tomorrow, on Tuesday, if they could not hold voting, those people would be effectively disenfranchised from making selections. Now, there would still be electors chosen for president. How they would be chosen would vary on state law in that state. The members of Congress who are up for election, as Doug was pointing out, would be chosen ultimately by the House of Representatives. And given the fact that our current status of our House of Representatives is that it's run by the Republican Party, it's likely the Republican Party would select Republicans to fill those seats. And that is how it would work. Now, people could get upset about that or think it wasn't legitimate, but that is the legal process that we would probably use in this country to deal with something like that. And so that would become, and I'm sure that there would be a million lawsuits. Doug would be very popular, and I would be very popular to get to testify as expert witnesses. But it would be, the process is it's very fragile for having some sort of contingency plan for that.
And 30 seconds, Michael, before
Yes.
It's important to note, first of all, that September 11th, 2001 was actually an election day in New York City. And in some places that election still went on, although obviously in other places it did not. But it's amazing to people like Thad and I that after both evidence of natural and terrible man-made disasters in this country, we can't seem to get Congress to pay attention to the need to address this very problem of a catastrophe. In fact, one observer likened it to a man who refuses to fix a leaky roof because it's not currently raining. And I'm hoping praying that Sandy and the related problems with it will finally get attention of enough people in Congress that we can at least have some answer to your question other than something that looks like this.
Thank you very much for those initial few questions. Please use the break over the next 20 minutes to consider more. We look forward to your participation in this plenary. Following the coffee break over the next 20 minutes, we'll reconvene at 4 p.m., 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.